Well, my computer says 12.
Okay, we have 60 waiting. Would you like me to open it?
Why don't we
Sure.
open? We'll banter a few minutes for other people to come in and then get going.
Witty
It's
banter.
open.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. As you join us, we decided we would just have to banter for a few moments to let people in. We are expecting over 100 people. We'll see how many actually come through. We're also expecting a couple of reporters who are interested, so be aware of that. With this crowd, we're probably not going to be able to do like hands and voice, but we do want to always encourage you to use the chat function. If you have any questions, we're going to, in a few minutes, kind of give you our expected agenda. There's going to be at least one point we're going to break into small groups to ask you to do some reaction. So as we come in, just to introduce myself, I am Mark Tallman with KASB, and people who are going to be joining me are Scott and Leon. I'll let you each introduce yourself.
I'm Leah Fighter. I'm Director of Governmental Relations for KASB.
And I'm Scott Rothschild. I'm the Communications Editor for KASB.
And we've got several other KASB staff members observing. We haven't promised we'll throw them any questions at this point, but they're certainly welcome to join in here from Zoom control, I guess. If there's anything that they want to add, we're certainly able to do that. As you come in, folks, what we're going to do is largely be kind of following a PowerPoint program that Leah's going to put up in a minute. As I said, just kind of want to remind you, we've got a pretty big crowd. We want to be sure to take questions if we can, but with this crowd, we'll kind of want you to put them in the chat. So hopefully you're able to use the chat function. We'll try to keep an eye on that as we go. We're seeing some hellos, so you know how to use that. That's great. And we are going to have at least one break, depending on how things, for some small group discussion. We're going to ask you guys to react to a couple things, so be ready for that. And of course, at the end, we'll try to take a little bit of time for questions. So Scott and Leah, am I forgetting anything as we let Leah bring up our opening slides?
No, I'm going to share my screen and then get started and get us into slide mode or presentation mode. Whoop. Okay, can everybody see that? All right.
Excellent. And again, I'll ask my colleagues to help us keep an eye on the keep an eye on the chat. I'm going to set myself up to do that. So Lee, if you want to move to kind of our agenda, we'll just quickly let people know what we're wanting to do. We're going to talk a little bit about the reopening plan release. We're not going to talk much about the plan because it is still very much in draft form. It's going to go to the State Board of Education. We're going to have a couple high-level thoughts on that and tell you how KASB will be preparing to help you with that as it becomes official. We're going to talk about kind of the state of the state budget after the governor made some actions to deal with our revenue shortfall. We're going to give you a few minutes to talk about kind of where your district is in the budgeting process, what questions you have. Leah's going to walk us through some federal issues that she's been tracking. We're going to talk about a couple of U.S. Supreme Court decisions that could have an impact for Kansas. We're going to talk about an executive order on foster care and some legislative interim studies, issues in the upcoming 2020 election where we are, and finally want to make sure, as always, we give you a chance to share your thoughts with us on KASB legislative priorities as we go forward. So that's how we're going to walk through this. Again, at any time you want to put up a question, whether on the current topic or just something you hope to get to, please use the chat to do that. So Leah, do you want to advance to kind of our reopening? So here's where we are. And again, I'm gonna touch on these quickly, but I'll invite my colleagues to share their observations if they can. The State Department of Education released a highly draft, they emphasize, report on work done toward reopening yesterday. It is still unofficial. It will go to the State Board of Education next week for action on Wednesday, July 15th. So in terms of actually getting this document, it will not be fully official, if you will, and we won't really know all the material or directives until the state board takes action. It can still change, and that's important to keep in mind. Next slide, Leah. Just a couple things we want that have been stressed, and as I told a reporter this morning, even this can change, but a key thing to keep in mind, at least as the commissioner and others have said, this is almost entirely a matter of guidance. It is advisory. Most of the decisions are going to be made by local board members. Whether that fills you with hope or terror, we don't know, but it is largely going to be, you're going to have to work this out, subject only to any state or local orders in place in your area. So if there is a local requirement, or if the state requirement on masks is in place, you have to follow that. If the state has, if your community has opted out of that, that's fine, in which case you'll have to make those decisions. The plan assumes, and is going under the operating assumption, is that schools will physically reopen next month. But the thinking for the last 3 months has, and this is not news, this has been what is explained, is that at least some students will learn remotely for all or part of the year, and all students may have to learn remotely for at least part of the year. That's a possibility, or districts can try to approach this in a hybrid of both. And then the last thing we think you need to be aware of, and again, I'll see whether there's any comments or further questions, is this has been developed in kind of two parts. One is to develop a plan for teaching and assessing essential skills, no matter how students are taught, across grade bands, with the idea of giving more flexibility and individuality. And a second part will look at the health and safety recommendations regarding district operations. So those are the two key parts, still subject to change, that we expect to be revealed next week. KASB is going to do some things with that, but does anyone want to comment, or are there any questions that we can answer that you want to share at this, about this very high level point of where we are? Scott or Leah, am I missing anything?
Well, I think part of it also is, and I think the commissioner has said this in the past, that districts should be in really close consultation with their health departments and county officials too. The spread of this is so uneven across the state. It's going to require really close consultation with the local folks, and also to let parents know what's going on, because that'll create buy-in.
Scott, I think you're absolutely right on that. That is continually said, this is local, and this is subject to change. Not only what the state may be saying, you as a district have to be ready to respond to changing circumstances. A couple months ago, who would have thought we would even be in this situation? To know where we will be in 2, 3, or 6, or 9 months, really hard to know. So locally driven, be flexible, be understanding, show grace, but understand we have to make sure we've got quality learning out there. I think those are the key points we're going to hear. Leah, if you want to bring up the next slide.
I just want to add real quick. I think, you know, if COVID is not particularly a big issue for your district at this point, lucky you, but this is your chance to start kind of building those relationships with your local health officials and with your parents, so that you are prepared in the event that you do have a sudden spike or you know, the need to pivot, as we like to say, and act on some issues. So we'll move to the next slide.
So just, and I'll note these, but again, if anyone wants to add, KASB is really going to have 3 opportunities in the next few weeks where we're going to be providing you with several opportunities to learn more. A week from today, July 17th, we're going to have an in-depth overview of the kind of framework that this represents. So that'll be a time when our staff, our leadership folks, our legal staff, and others will have had a chance to really look through this and have some advice for boards on what it means and how you can begin using it, kind of advice on the immediate task you'll have to face, those longer term issues. Then, if you kind of keep going clockwise, on the 20th, 22nd, and 23rd in the evening, we're going to have 3, we're calling them regional roundtables because we've kind of grouped them by KASB region. You don't have to attend the one for your region. You can attend whatever works for you, but we're encouraging people to kind of go a little bit around their part of the state. And so those are laid out. Those will be about an hour and a half in the evening, specifically aimed at being available for board members. And finally, we're going to continue with Wednesdays at noon will be a weekly leadership support opportunity for boards and leadership teams to meet with our leadership services staff on an ongoing basis where we can answer your questions and kind of take some of the big things that we start to hear that people are most worried about. So just as we did last spring, as we were dealing with all the problems that started coming up that no one had thought about, as those begin to emerge, as we move back into school, we'll be doing the same thing. Questions or comments on that? Okay, Leah, if you want to next move into kind of where we are with the governor's budget, we're going to talk a little bit about that, and then what we're going to do when we move through this is put you into kind of some small groups to ask you to have just a little sharing with each other about what your experience has been and concerns you might have on budget. So governor's budget plan and state revenues, Leah, if you want to advance to where we are. I think we told you repeatedly after April about the shift in our state budget situation, how we moved from, you know, a projected surplus next year of over $700 million in the state general fund to a projected deficit that is now estimated to be at about $700 million due to a reduction in state revenue estimates of about $1.2 billion. Last week, just while some of us were trying to be on vacation, I might add, the governor came up with kind of her long-awaited plan to move us through this. So we're going to kind of let you know the top line results of that. Leah, next slide. So the key thing is this. Here's the good news. The governor's proposal would avoid major cuts in K-12 education. It fully funds the finance formula, base state aid at the increases set forth in the Gannon settlement. It fully funds the major aid programs that require equalization, local option budgets, capital outlay, bonds, and interest. It fully funds the contributions to the CAPER system, which has been something in the past that the state has cut or delayed to manage through these. It avoids major cuts. I'm not going to say all cuts, but it avoids kind of structural cuts in social services, higher education. It does not remove more money from the highway fund, and it closes a projected deficit of over $700 million. So how is this possible after we've been telling you about our concerns? Well, again, here's a detailed slide. Here's the key thing to remember. The good news is we avoided cuts. The kind of bad news is the governor can't do all this on her own, and it requires on a lot of one-time funding that if things rebound can get us through, but means we have to continue to be wary about the future. The biggest thing is that some of you may remember 4 or 5 years ago, the legislature borrowed $263 million, actually probably more at the time, basically from state idle funds, called the Pool Money Investment Board. The governor had proposed in her budget paying that back this year and over the next 2 years because the state had plenty of money. Her new proposal is just to not pay that back. So that pulls in $264 million of that $700 million. But the legislature is going to have to approve that, and that's one-time money coming in. There isn't another $264 million of idle funds available that we know of now, although, of course, it's amazing what you can find when you look. So that's the biggest chunk. The second largest piece of the puzzle is the federal government, because of the pandemic, has increased its Medicaid matching, and that reduces what the state has to put in by about $140 million. That's very good, but the asterisk there is that is not a permanent reduction in the state's matching share. So when and if that moves back up, the state is going to have to replace those dollars. It delays next year almost $80 million in state school aid that is supposed to be paid next June will be shifted to July. As many of you know, but many of our newer school board members may not know, every year the state does not pay on time a portion of the final state aid payment, basically requiring you districts to float the money until you get it at the beginning of July. It's just an accounting shift, but of course that also means that this $80 million that won't be paid next year to save money is just shifted to the following year and will have to be accounted for. The governor cuts higher education by $26 million, replaces that with some federal money that was given to governors with some discretion. Moratorium on contribution to KAPERS, death and disability. All you really need to know is that shouldn't have any effect this year, but sooner or later that moratorium is going to have to come off. So this is not a permanent savings. It's like a one-time way to reduce money here. There were some cuts made to K-12 education. The governor eliminates the school safety grants some of you have received and reduces approved growth in the school mental health program by about $9 million. So pretty small in the scheme of things, but there were some reductions made there. Finally, the governor has basically said of money that the state appropriated to respond to COVID, because we're getting so much federal money, we won't need about $20 million of that, but the governor will have to, or the legislature will have to go along with that. And the governor has also said there's about $42 million in money that was supposedly being set aside for evidence-based juvenile programs at the local level. And according to the administration, that's not being used, and that money could be pulled back into the general fund. That would also require legislative action. So the total of this and the number of other targeted programs is you get to that savings, which is positive, but again, these are not structural changes. But there's still some more good news, if you want to go to the next slide, Leah, and that is, for one thing, ever since that bad news in April on revenues coming down, the actual revenues have been higher than was expected. In other words, we through the end of the fiscal year, we took in $164 million more than was thought in April. Now, that's still $422 million less than a year ago. We're still in a much worse revenue picture, but it's not as bad as we thought. That will roll into this year's ending balance, which will help for next year's. And those higher revenues mean, presumably, as the state comes out of the recession, we hope, there'll be a higher base to rebound from. Now, the concerns are, of course, that if the economic impact of COVID delays the recovery, causes further shutdowns, unemployment aid could be expiring, all of these things could worsen the economy. And then what we will note is, and Leah's going to talk to you a little bit more later, there is new kind of renewed, once again, we're talking about another federal stimulus package that could help both economically and on the revenue front. So guys, before we kind of break out and ask you, we're going to ask you to get into groups. Scott, Leah, or anyone, any thoughts you want to make, observations on this, and we'll see if there's any questions in the chat.
Well, I think the governor has been talking for weeks about the need for federal aid, and I think that's an important thing for us to keep in our minds. Maybe when we talk with our congressional representatives, that the states need aid. I mean, you know, we shut down our economy for over a month, and that's going to take its toll.
Scott's right. This is a high priority for the National Governors Association, and our federal group, the National School Boards Association, is working closely with them and other groups on this additional federal funding. And we'll talk more about that, as Mark noted, in a few minutes.
I think the one thing to keep in mind, and we always struggle with how to share this information with you, because we don't want to say the sky is falling. The governor continued to say she wanted to protect education. State Department people said, we trust the governor, we think we're going to be okay, and it looks like we are okay. So we don't want to always be crying wolf. We want to commend the fact that the governor did come up with this plan. But as I noted, some of this, in fact, a great deal of this will take legislative approval, And we've already heard some legislators saying, well, these aren't real cuts and we need to make structural changes. So we can't just say everything is fine. We have to continue to focus on what may happen if the legislature does not support their end, or what may happen in the future if there isn't either federal aid or an economic recovery. Okay, Leah is our next slide to bring us up to, okay, we want to give you just a minute to kind of have some discussion among yourselves, so you're not just listening to us. We're just going to put you, I think, into some random breakout groups for just about 5 minutes or so. We would just ask you to kind of share, when you get on, unmute yourself, introduce yourself, just kind of talk a little bit about what is your district experiencing right now. Did you consider cuts? Do you feel better about that? Are you facing new expenses because of COVID? A little bit of where are you in the process? With this number, we're not going to ask for a real formal report back, but we would ask if there's some things that struck you as important or that you want to share. When you come back in, put it in the chat or share it with us, particularly if it's around something KASB could do. So I'm going to ask Melissa to do this, and then we'll bring you back in about 5 minutes.
You do a breakout group and everybody leaves the meeting. I bet you 25 people left.
Okay, I'm going to unmute myself and remind probably Leah and Scott to do the same. As far as everyone else, again, we would welcome if you have anything that you thought was particularly striking from your groups as you're coming back. Please put that in the chat. Share that with us if you can. Leah, do you want to put the slides back up? Excellent. Leah, why don't you take over here for federal issues?
All right, I'll do that. Well, as we've been talking about reopening schools and some of the projected costs, our friends at the Superintendents Association and the School Business Officers Association put together a really handy graphic here of projected costs of reopening schools, and it's everything from health concerns to hiring issues and PPE, those kinds of things. Again, of course, this is going to depend on, for your particular district, these costs may or may not be incurred. It's going to depend on what the situation is like in your community and what your needs are. But they estimated that an average school district of about 3,500 and some students is going to incur additional expenses of about $1.7 million. And I think some of you all are already dealing with those, and you're trying to figure out, are you going to get spark money for that? Can you deficit spend for some of these things? How are you going to wrap up your negotiations with your teachers when you've got all of these costs as well? And so what we are hearing about is that there will be a new stimulus bill that will make its way through Congress before they recess in August. In August, they take a relatively lengthy recess because it's an election year, and folks have campaigning that they want to do. So when they leave for the August recess, they don't come back until September 7th after Labor Day. So if there's going to be a stimulus bill, which the governors are pushing hard for, the education associations are pushing hard for, and a number of other interest groups as well, it's going to have to happen in July here. So we're going to have to be aware, we're going to have to be paying attention, and we're going to have to be contacting our members of Congress. The hope is that any new stimulus bill will include at least $175 billion for K-12 and an education stabilization fund, that it will provide some funding to boost state budgets, stimulate the economy, allow some investments. Again, we keep harking back to the Recovery Act funding that the federal government provided back in 2008 through about 2010 in response to the Great Recession. That did help schools and other governments respond and keep their doors open, and that's kind of the model that folks are continuing to push for as we work with Congress through this COVID pandemic. There's a hope for, at least maybe $12 billion for IDEA for the next school year. Some homework gap funding. Homework gap, we'll talk about that in just a little bit. Many of you probably already know that's the homework gap refers to kids who may not have access at home to either broadband internet or to devices to access at-home learning. And of course, that's going to be a significant issue for many of our school districts in the upcoming school year. And we'll talk a little bit about how perhaps some recovery funds might be tied to reopening, some rhetoric from the administration on that. Let's talk real quick first about the homework gap. Many of you, if you follow us regularly and have been attending these updates, know that the homework gap is the inequity between many students have access at home to fast broadband internet. They have a number of devices like the students that you see in this slide, laptop, device, iPad, phone, and they've got the internet to back it up. But other kids don't have broadband, or they don't have a device, or they don't have either. And as we move into trying to plan for hybrid learning for the fall, that is certainly an issue that many of us are dealing with. And so on Tuesday, July 21st, roughly 2 weeks, there's going to be a nationwide day of action around the homework gap. the National School Boards Association, the Superintendents Association, the Teachers Associations, and several prominent non-education advocacy groups. Some of the civil rights organizations and other advocacy groups are going to be contacting Congress and asking for their support for at least $4 billion in funding to address the homework gap. There's a study that is coming out I think it's just been released, and I have not yet seen the details yet, but apparently we now know after COVID, we've got 15 million students nationwide who lack access or a device, and then we have 9 million students who don't have either. So that's a lot of school kids who don't have internet, or they don't have a device to access it on. And, you know, as we all know, it's pretty hard to do your English paper on your phone when you're relying on your parents' cell data, if you've got coverage at all. And if, you know, you've been able to keep that cell phone when your parents have been laid off or furloughed. We also know from this study, it's from Common Sense Media, that 400,000 teachers are also affected by this lack of access either to a device or to broadband internet. So they're trying to teach from home without some of the tools that they need. So it's going to be critical to get this included in that next stimulus bill that we hope Congress will pass in July. And so we are going to be planning to participate in this National Day of Action on July 21st. And we'll be sharing messaging with you, talking points, some graphics, other devices like that you can use to help participate in this National Day of Action. Does anybody have any questions or comments about the homework gap or federal action around reopening schools? Okay, I'll move on. Well, you know, we have known since the beginning of the Trump presidency that we deal with an administration and an education secretary who does have a proclivity to favoring private schools. Betsy DeVos is the education secretary, but none of her children attended public schools, and there's been a preference expressed in each of the president's budgets thus far to funnel some funding, some public funding to private schools. That preference has usually been rejected by Congress. Congress tends to look at that budget request to funnel, you know, billions of dollars to private schools, and they have kind of turned that away. And we've seen another angle now through this CARES Act funding. As you know, there was a pot of money that was distributed to the states to go to K-12 education. Public schools received the CARES Act funding based on the number of Title I students in their districts. I'm sure you all are kind of familiar with that formula and how it affects your school district. But the Secretary of Education in April came out with what's called a guidance. It's a non-binding guidance document, but it kind of expresses the intent of the Secretary and the intent of the Department of Education that if you're a local public school district and you provide some Title I funding to some of your local private schools, perhaps for Title I or other services that take place at that private school, that instead of you, school district A, expending some of that private school, expending some of that CARES Act money to the private school based on the number of Title I students that they serve, instead, you must calculate your disbursement to that private school based on the total number of students in the private school. And as you know, those two numbers are quite different. And especially in the case of most private schools in the country and in Kansas, the number of low-income students served by a private school is usually much, much less than what public schools provide. So as you can imagine, when this guidance was released and rhetoric began from the administration, there was quite a bit of pushback from the national school boards and other associations about this guidance. And frankly, most states just kind of advise their school districts, you know, just that's non-binding, just ignore it, you know, and we'll just move on with our lives. And so as a result, the Department of Education has now released an interim final rule, it's called, that says, oh no, you do have some choices to make about how you're going to share CARES Act funding with your private schools, and it's going to, pardon me, force some interesting conversations for local school boards. It's hoped, you know, to be pushed through pretty quickly. It was published in the Federal Register on July 1st, and comments for or against are due on July 31st, and that's actually a relatively quick turnaround for the federal government. So that kind of shows you that the interest is in making this become final. As a result, 5 states, including Michigan, which is Secretary DeVos's home state, and also Wisconsin, have sued to get that rule stopped. So we're watching that, and we'll probably be notifying you all when we submit comments and against the rule. And when we do, we will be sharing those with our members of Congress. And so we will be sure that you know about those and are able to discuss those with members of Congress as they're on their August break back in the districts campaigning. Any questions? This gets very into the weeds about what the mechanisms might be, how you would need to disperse this CARES Act funding to your local private schools. And so if we want to talk about that more, we might want to do that offline. But just suffice it to say that 5 states have sued, and so this is kind of in something of limbo right now, but this rule technically is in effect right now, pending comments at the end of July and pending this lawsuit. So that's just kind of something to be aware of. Mark, did you want to, you know, before we go to that, I want to also address, you know, we've heard several comments just over the last couple of days from the administration about withholding CARES Act funding if schools don't reopen. That is not likely to happen. There's really no way that the president can halt that funding. It is administered under the ESSA Act, which is, you know, the primary federal mechanism for distribution of federal funding to the states. So that is in train. The president really cannot interrupt that process. However, where we could see some movement on tying funds to reopening everybody in school, in person, all day, 5 days a week, could be through the development and enactment of this hoped for additional federal funding that we hope is coming from Congress. So this is, again, something that we're going to have to be aware of, and we're going to have to be very involved with, particularly as the senators and members of Congress are back in Kansas in August campaigning for election or re-election. So any questions about reopening schools and the federal effort to at least threaten to cut off funding? Okay, if not, I think we're going to move on to some federal court issues with Mark.
Leah mentioned that, you know, some states are suing, and when that happens, ultimately it becomes a judicial decision. We've had a couple of decisions from the U.S. Supreme Court that will have some impact or potential impact on schools and on Kansas. One, several weeks ago now, dealt with LGBT employees and their protection. Scott, I think you put this slide together. Do you want to hit these points real quick?
Well, sure. This was a case of several employees that was brought together. These employees alleged that they were fired because of the gender identity that they presented themselves at work instead of their birth, their gender at birth. And basically, they were relying on Title VII of the 1964 Civil Rights Act that said you can't discriminate against someone because of sex. And the whole question pivoted, does sex include prohibiting bias against people because of their gender identity? And the court ruled it does. So now LGBT workers in most states were not protected but from discrimination at the workplace, including Kansas. And based on this decision, they will be. And so I guess now that employees will be protected and can't be discriminated against because of their sexual preference or identity, the question becomes, of course, school districts have to comply, and then alternatively, the question becomes, do we extend these same rights to our transgender students? Several districts have these kinds of policies. I believe most do not, but I think that's a question that will keep arising as we go forward.
And I'm sure our KASB legal team will be developing more specific guidance around this. And so stay tuned for that. But again, this really resolves a long-standing question about whether current federal law provides protection against discrimination for these workers. And that rationale could certainly apply to Title IX, which affects students, as opposed to Title VII, which is what concerns employees. Another decision, Lee, if you could move, that we'll mention very quickly, is it is a case that involved a similar provision in Montana's constitution to our Kansas constitution, prohibiting state funding to support private religious schools. And essentially, the Supreme Court said that states, even if it's in their constitution, cannot limit funding or not fund religious schools if they fund other private schools. And I think that's really kind of the issue. Chief Justice Roberts, who wrote the decision, said states are not required to fund private schools, but if they do, they cannot discriminate against religious schools. In Kansas, we have a similar law to the one that the Montana Supreme Court had struck down, that the U.S. Supreme Court has upheld. Our law has not been challenged, but this would suggest that if someone attempted to challenge our law because it provides tax credits for religious schools, that we would not be allowed to do that under this decision. Again, we'll probably look forward to more detailed analysis from our legal team as we go forward. Leah? A couple things we'll hit very quickly here as we move to wrapping up. Some of you may remember during the legislature, we reported on a proposal to create a foster care education report card. Ultimately, that was passed the last day of the regular session, but it was bundled into another bill that was vetoed by Governor Kelly because of other issues included within it. And an attempt to pass a similar bill failed during the special session. It did not advance during the special session. So Governor Kelly, who said her objection was not to this idea, has issued a executive order that will require, can you go to the next slide, Leah? I'm forgetting
Sure.
whether, yes. So again, we'll get you more detail, but this is the list of things that the Department of Children and Families and the Department of Education must annually report. A number of measures like graduation rates and suspensions, expulsions, state test scores, enrollment in certain programs, disaggregated data by race are all things that will now have to be collected from information you provide or will be asked to be provided in annual reports to see the disparities between, non-foster kids and foster kids. One more slide, please, Leah. We would also note that the legislature has approved an interim study of foster care. As I think many of you know, there have been massive problems in our state foster care system, which is growing rapidly. In fact, we've seen about a 40% increase in foster kids over the last decade. And I guess here's the thing to keep in mind: expect greater scrutiny for what school districts are doing. We know there's long-standing concerns about communication and record sharing and continuity of service. The problem, of course, is that foster kids tend to move around a lot, and that really creates problems in record sharing, continuity of programs, assembling credits to graduate. And a longtime superintendent I spoke to once put it this way: we all love local control, but it's not very good for foster kids because it really creates the opportunity for these kids to kind of get lost in the shuffle. So I think we can expect a lot more state attention as to how we're responding to this group, which tends to lag far behind their peers on most education indicators. Any comments from Scott or Leah, or any questions?
Well, and we may want to mention, I think this week, wasn't there a settlement reached on
Yes,
the
that's right.
lawsuit against the state for the treatment of kids in foster care? And basically the settlement puts it to the state to improve conditions noticeably.
Yeah, good
So as Mark
point.
said, you're going to be under additional scrutiny regarding the kids in foster care in your district. So be aware.
Yeah, and from a viewpoint of getting more kids to succeed, that's fine. But remember, it sometimes calls upon looking at how we do things different for a group with a different set of needs. Okay, Leah, I think we've got a slide which just notes there were a couple of other legislative interim studies that we will be watching. One is to kind of look at state policies that would help the economic recovery from COVID. Another that would look at that state law that has been the point of contention over the governor's power during an emergency that has been the real issue. So they're wanting to take a long-term look, as a lot of provisions of that law are very, very old and was really not designed to respond to a pandemic. And then finally, another issue that may have some implications for school is a committee to study mental health modernization and reform. We all know that mental health has been a big concern at the school level. The mental health pilot programs in school districts could come up. And this does not necessarily exhaust the list. These are committees that have been approved so far. There may be more, and there are permanent committees that also could be looking at school-related topics. So follow your KASB advocacy reporting, and we'll let you know what those are. Next slide, please. Leah.
Yes, well, as you may have heard, there's a number of big elections this year, and the last day to register to vote in the Kansas primary election is coming up. That's July 14th. The election for the primary is August 4th, and so as a result, advance voting for that election begins the day after registration closes. So your last day to register to vote for the primary is July 14th, and then on July 15th, you can begin advance voting in person or by mail. For those of you who follow the Kansas legislature with us, there are, I think, 19 legislative seats that are going to be decided this year on August 4th. 14 members of the House and 5 members of the state Senate, if I remember correctly. So those are important elections to participate in and be aware of. And then your last day to register to vote for the November general election is on October 13th. And then the general election is on November 3rd. So some important dates to remember there. And we just encourage everyone to get out and vote.
Then I think we have a slide on some resources.
Yes, Mark put together an excellent video. It's about 15 minutes that we posted on our YouTube channel, and it gives a nice overview of education issues that you can discuss with your local either lawmakers or candidates. And we've also converted that video to a podcast that you can find at that link. So for those of you who like the video or the podcast versions, we have those resources available for you.
We're putting those links regularly in our news briefs and social media. So again, if you know candidates that you think would benefit from a kind of by my standards, quick introduction, this is available. If you know voters who want that, and of course we're always seeking feedback. I know many of you would probably find these remarkably short. We can do longer, but if you have feedback on ways to fine-tune the time and the options, we are always looking for that. So Want you to know those are available. We need your help to share them. Leah, does that bring us to like our last question?
I believe it does.
So rather than making you get into groups again, we have a little more than 5 minutes left here. We would ask you if you could go ahead and kind of put in the chat, and there's still going to be time now if you have any questions to put in the chat. We're in the process of collecting top concerns for action for the legislature, state board, and Congress, particularly after the election when we move into next year. So as our legislative committee starts meeting next month, we're wanting to hear what you think are critical issues. So before you leave, before you sign off, we'd like, if there's something an issue or a question to bring up. And while you're doing that, let's open it up one more time. Please don't be shy. Norm Wilkes, I know you had a question. I can come back to that. If you have any questions, we'll try to respond to them now. Because I put Norm on the spot, I think what he was just asking, budget guy that he is, if this is the governor's plan and it works, what do we do next year? And I think that's why we keep coming back to, we either have to hope for a strong recovery, or we have to hope for federal aid to bridge us through until that recovery comes. I think that's what it comes down to. Budget Director Larry Campbell basically said, you know, this is as good as it's going to get from protecting and preserving state programs. They really did everything they could to avoid cuts, and so that's I think that's where we need to be. We'll note, yeah, we will make this. I think we can just send this PowerPoint out to registrants. I'm asking anyone that knows. We'll
As
try
well,
to
and
do that.
I'm also planning, if folks would like, I'll post it on our website. So go to kasb.org and then go to advocacy and then click on key resources. And I'll post this PowerPoint and it'll have a really creative name like Advocacy Update July 10th, something like that. So I'll post it there and we can also email it to folks.
And as soon as we go through the laborious process of converting this to different platforms, we'll be posting this this video. So for your friends that missed it, they'll have an opportunity to view it in a recorded form. Marlene, great point. We're sharing with you this information, so you, as you talk to legislators and candidates, what the governor's plan, the cuts it allows us to avoid. And so, yeah, that's what I think we're trying to stress. The budget picture, you know, much better for next year, thanks to the governor's action at this point. But we can't think everything is solved. Loss of enrollment, should parents hold students out, cannot get them on count? You know, that raises, I think, two really important questions. And I think what you're saying, number one, you know, students have the option to opt out. They can be homeschooled, they can go to a virtual school. So you can't make kids come to your school if they don't want to be there. What you hopefully can do is offer them remote alternatives. That's what the state board plan is designed to do. But you are noting there's some accountability there that says they are to document their participation. And I think that's something we're going to have to very carefully look at. And if that becomes an issue of enforcement, that's hopefully something we can identify and talk about early on, and even consider looking at next year as something to avoid that budget problem if you're losing students. Great questions and comments. Any other comments people would like to share? Again, we just need to hear from you. What are your big concerns so that we can kind of help our legislative committee understand what's on your mind and what the state can do to help. So we want to hear that. And you certainly can share these with us individually, with your legislative committee members, your KASB board members, or others.
There is a question in the chat. Are other school districts doing surveys to parents on whether they're sending their kids to school, or have they decided they're keeping them home?
Okay, I'm forgetting whether we have an easy way to poll people, so I don't know whether we can quickly ask on that if someone can. Looks like we are getting some responses. Those would be good.
I can do a poll real quick. Hang on.
If you can do that, that'd be good. I get just the question, are you doing a survey or not? So what we're seeing people answering, that I believe may be in the state guidance document, is some suggested language in that area. Again, we'll find out next week as Melissa does a snap poll here. Sending it out next week, we're seeing.
Just a second, just a second. Yes.
You know, we in broadcasting abhor dead air. That's our problem.
Mark in particular.
Seeing some good responses though. Thank you.
Okay, I just launched it.
Perfect. If you can see that, just yes or no. Let us know if you're doing a survey, and I think you just click and submit, and then we'll watch those numbers, or at least Melissa will.
Mm-hmm.
But I can't vote, so I'm going to close it out.
We have about 74 yeses and 11 noes, or 74% yeses and 26% noes.
Okay, so many are, some aren't, and maybe some that are not will be doing so in the future if they kind of hear what's going on. Okay, we are down to about 1 minute before 1. We certainly thank all of you. Thank you, Melissa, for participating today. We hope you continue to join us. If you've got any suggestions on that, and welcoming your feedback.
I think Mark seems